there is a really good chance you're overlooking these wide receivers. Because when you're scrolling through statistics and looking for who you're going to be drafting next year, a lot of the time you're only looking at the volume and you're not checking the efficiency. But when we have guys with a lot of efficiency, when they do get more volume, they could absolutely go off. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Today, I am talking about my top 5 rising wide receivers when it comes to how well they did in volume categories last season to where they finished in efficiency categories instead. And these guys saw the biggest jump from their overall volume to their overall efficiency, and that could mean big things ahead. So make sure you hit that like button, make sure you subscribe if you're new here, and if you want to get our 2024 Fantasy Football Draft Guide for free, you can do so right now by creating a new account and depositing over on Underdog. All you got to do is download their app, create a new account, and make a deposit of at least $10 using code word Headliners. When you do that, you are going to get a deposit bonus, you're going to get a special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit, and you're going to get our 2024 Fantasy Football Draft Guide for free. And I can tell you right now, you're not going to want to miss anything on our fantasy guide this year. If you want to take your fantasy game to the next level, this is the way to do it. But Headliner Nation, now it is time to jump into my top 5 wide receivers that saw a huge growth from their volume to their efficiency. And number 1 may not surprise anybody, and it could be the next big breakout candidate at wide receiver, George Pickens of the Steelers. With Deontay Johnson gone and potentially the most competent quarterback situation the Steelers have had since Ben Roethlisberger, George Pickens is definitely a very popular pick to have his breakout season. And I mean, breakout might be a relative term because the dude had over 1,100 receiving yards last season. But those 1,100 yards came more from his efficiency than his volume. He saw a 25 spot jump from where he finished overall in volume to where he finished overall in efficiency. And when you take a look at the wide receivers last season that had the most volume in the league, George Pickens was among the best in efficiency. First in yards per reception, third in yards per target, and third in yards after the catch per reception. He was making plays down the field consistently. And then, of course, all of his worst categories came over in the volume department. For receptions, he finished 32nd, and his red zone usage was non-existent. But like I already mentioned, the situation in Pittsburgh this year is a lot better for George Pickens to see more consistent volume than it ever has been before. And his current ADP could end up being quite a bit of a steal. Because right now, he's going 41st overall as the wide receiver 28 off the board. George Pickens is only being looked at like a mid-range wide receiver 3, which means on draft day, you could end up getting great value for him. And George Pickens may end up being a better best ball pick than a redraft pick until we see some more consistency. So his ADP over on Underdog actually may end up being a little bit higher than what his ADP ends up being in redraft leagues when those start to kick up. But I banged the George Pickens drum very heavily last season, and I thought that he was going to have a much better campaign than 2022, and he did. Now, it came with inconsistencies, and that was due to a lot of the factors around him. But this year, if he ends up getting a majority of the volume on that team, and he can potentially lead that team in targets or be close to it, and he keeps at least some of that efficiency, George Pickens could definitely see a great return from being drafted as a wide receiver 3 to giving you at least wide receiver 2 numbers. Brandon Aiyuk only finished 1 spot behind George Pickens for the highest jump from volume to efficiency, seeing a 24 spot increase in those categories. But to be quite honest, Brandon Aiyuk may have been more impressive when it came to his efficiency last season. I mean, the dude had 3 less receptions in 2023 than he did in 2022, but he had over 300 more receiving yards. His best categories: yards per target, he was first. Yards per reception, he was second. Points per touch, he was third. And his worst categories: 31st in targets while still having over 1,300 receiving yards. That's absolutely ridiculous. And just like some of the other guys we've looked at, his red zone usage was really poor, but that's not surprising given the fact that they're going towards Christian McCaffrey and George Kittle a lot in those situations. But Brandon Aiyuk is also going to be the most expensive player in this video that you'll need to invest in order to see him on your team this season. Because right now he's going 18th overall as a mid-second round pick as the wide receiver 12 off the board. Now in best ball leagues, that's a little spicy because more than likely you're taking him as your wide receiver 1 unless you went with a different wide receiver in the first round. And Brandon Aiyuk is going to continue to see a lot of the same type of gameplay that we saw from him last season. He is on a team with a ton of weapons right now. George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, Christian McCaffrey, and because of that, the targets aren't always going to come his way on a consistent basis. But we do know for a fact that he is going to make some huge plays down the field. And as of this recording, he is still with San Francisco, but depending on when you watch this video, maybe he would have been traded before then, and that would completely change this entire outcome. And for me personally, in redraft leagues, I couldn't go any higher than having him as my wide receiver 2. So if you're spending a first round pick on a running back, more than likely you will not be drafting Brandon Aiyuk in the second round. And if you do, that is definitely some big inconsistencies you could find with your wide receiver 1. But if you're looking to go wide receiver heavy this season and you spend your first round pick on a guy like Tyreek Hill or CeeDee Lamb or another top wide receiver, then maybe Brandon Aiyuk in the second round, if you're trying to hit a home run right away, wouldn't end up killing you as your wide receiver 2. Just make sure you balance your team the rest of the way. How about a big shout out here to Jaylen Waddle, seeing a 20 spot jump from where he finished overall in volume to where he finished overall in efficiency, which is good to see because with Tyreek Hill being your wide receiver 1, you're not going to see wide receiver 1 type volume. So let's see wide receiver 1 type efficiency. He finished 5th in yards after the catch per reception last year, and when you have defenses trying to keep an eye on the run game in the backfield, try to keep up with Tyreek Hill down the field, you're going to have a lot of open space to roam after the catch. Then in points per snap, he finished 6th, and yards per target, he finished 10th. And like a lot of the wide receivers we talked about so far, one of their worst categories came with their red zone targets. But then his overall targets and his overall receptions both ended up finishing outside the top 25 as well. And I just mentioned it, with Jaylen Waddle, you're not going to see wide receiver 1 type volume. So he's got to make up for it somewhere. And he was a little bit banged up last year, so hopefully he ends up being healthy for all of 2024. And if he is, he could end up giving you a really nice return on investment. But it's all going to depend upon where his ADP ends up landing, because right now it may be a little on the high side. If you're wanting to grab Jaylen Waddle, you're going to have to use your second round pick. He's going about 20th overall right now as the wide receiver 15 off the board. I would love to get a little bit more value with that pick right there. If we could end up getting him at the start of the third round, that would be great. And with these being best ball ADPs right now, we could see some fluctuation where redraft participants decide, yeah, we're not going to take him until the third round, and that would give us a lot better value on him. Because realistically, the only way I'm going to be in on Jaylen Waddle this season is if my draft strategy allows me to go wide receiver, running back, and then Jaylen Waddle, or running back, wide receiver, and then Jaylen Waddle in the third. I can't envision myself spending a third round pick on Jaylen Waddle as my wide receiver 1, knowing that consistently the volume just won't be there. All right, here he is. I know a lot of you watching this video have been patiently waiting for this name to pop up, wondering where Nico Collins finished last season. And he saw a big 16 spot jump from his volume all the way up to his efficiency. Almost 1,300 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns, and he barely cracked 100 targets. For yards per target and yards after the catch per reception, he finished second last season, and his points per snap ended up being third. And like basically everyone else we've talked about so far, a couple of his worst categories was how often he was targeted in the red zone. But his overall targets, like I just mentioned, barely over 100, 109 last season, ended up putting him down towards the bottom of that volume list. And for as expensive that Brandon Aiyuk may end up being, Nico Collins is going to end up being just as expensive. And that's why both Aiyuk and Collins are going to bring a lot of risk this season. Right now, Collins is the 19th overall player drafted and the wide receiver 14 over on Underdog. And I love Nico Collins. Last season, we had him pegged as a prime breakout candidate. But there is a big difference between Nico Collins this year and Nico Collins last year. Now, let's just say, for the heck of the argument, that Nico Collins provides you the same outcome in 2024 that he had in 2023. You probably wouldn't hate that. Those receiving numbers last year were really good. No worse this season and no better this season. Exactly what he did in 2023. And given the fact that the offense around him in Houston is going to be better and there's going to be a lot of targets to get the ball to, it's realistic to expect something like that. The problem is that last season you drafted him as like your wide receiver 4 or wide receiver 5. The dude wasn't picked up until late in your drafts. This season, if you want to invest in Nico Collins, you got to draft him as your wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2. Last season, when he gave you a huge game, it was awesome because it wasn't expected. You weren't drafting him to be that type of a wide receiver. This season, you have to have those games from him, and you have to have them on a more consistent basis if you're drafting him that high. Now, Nico Collins, I am smashing the draft button on wherever I can in best ball leagues. I absolutely love him in best ball. Again, as your wide receiver 2, I think it is a great fit. In redraft leagues, though, if you have to draft him as your wide receiver 1 or a wide receiver 2, that is where I start to hate the ADP of Nico Collins. And I don't hate players, I hate ADPs. And even though I love Nico Collins, I could definitely skip on him if he becomes way too expensive. All right, the last wide receiver we're going to be talking about today is going to be Rashod Rice. And this one may be the most interesting one that we discuss. Rashod Rice saw a 16-spot jump last season from his volume to his efficiency, which honestly caught me a little bit off guard. But it wasn't until after their bye week in week 10 last season that he really became more heavily utilized in the offense. But his utilization in the offense this year isn't going to be the question. It's going to be whether or not he's even on the field. And let me preface this segment by saying something really serious for a minute. I'm not a lawyer, I don't work in the law, I'm not a judge, and I'm not here to judge other human beings. Now, Rashod Rice obviously was in a really bad situation. And obviously, if he's found guilty, he absolutely did something that he needs to be punished for. But I'm not handing down punishments. I'm giving you fantasy football information. So we're going to talk about it in that sense. If you've got a thought on Rashod Rice, you're more than welcome to it. For right now, we're just talking about football though. His number 1 category last season actually caught me off guard. Among qualifiers, he finished first in catch percentage. But he also finished first in yards after the catch per reception, and then he finished 4th in points per snap. Now, some of his worst categories last season came with targets and came from receiving yards. Now, those will be interesting categories to keep an eye on this season, given the weapons that have been added. But then his yards per reception ended up being one of his worst categories as well. And again, right now with the impending suspension that could end up happening, people are choosing not to draft Rashod Rice any earlier than they may need to. He's going 74th overall as the wide receiver 45 off the board. And that seems about right. You're not going to spend an early pick on a wide receiver that could end up missing time this season. But that's where you have to decide what type of risk you want to play. With the numbers that we see here, Rashod Rice was very efficient last season in multiple areas of his game. And even if he doesn't see a huge uptick in volume this season because you have Xavier Worthy, you have Marquise Brown, you still have Travis Kelce, and even though Kansas City will throw the ball a lot, they're still going to try and stay somewhat balanced with Isaiah Pacheco, he may not see a huge increase in his target share. But that's okay, because with all of those weapons around him, as long as as he can maintain some of the efficiency that we see here, he could end up way overperforming that current ADP that he has. And if you want to draft him at this current ADP, absolutely have at it. If he ends up being suspended, he doesn't end up costing you that much later in your draft. But if he does end up playing, even if he only ends up missing a few games during the season, he absolutely could smash that ADP and end up becoming a guy that you put in your lineup every single week. Yo, Headliner Nation, hopefully you enjoyed hearing about my top 5 risers from volume to efficiency. Make sure you hit that like button, make sure you subscribe if you're new here to the channel, and turn on that bell notification so anytime we go live, you'll end up seeing our content pop up right away. And like Jake has said, something like 30% of our current viewers aren't even subscribed to the channel, so make sure you check to see if you are and hit that button. But for now, Headliner Nation, I'm gonna get out of here. YouTube is probably recommending one of our last videos to you right about now. If you missed it, click on it. Peace out, Headliner Nation. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.